fat burns in the flame of carbohydrates. Hello and welcome to another vlog on YouTube and podcast on Spotify by the Fit Minds podcast. Coach Mariah Jean here. I'm riding solo today. Sorry about the hat that I've been wearing lately a lot. I have postpartum hair loss, and I'm sure another mum or two could relate to that. So the hat is nice to cover up my frizzies. Alex got it for me. I've got a really small head and hats don't usually suit me or fit me, but I guess that's why my daughter was born with a small head. Both Alex and I have these like ridiculously small heads. Don't ask me why. So hats don't usually fit me. Anyway, let's get stuck into today's topic, which is the importance of your pre-training snack, your pre-workout meal, whatever you want to call it, your carbs before training. We know that now predominantly the most important fuel source prior to training is going to be carbohydrates. Water is actually the first. Sorry, I stand corrected. Water is the first and carbohydrates being the second. So with regards to CHO, carbohydrates, we want to consume a decent serving of them prior to training. And this might be a little bit of a foreign concept for, I would say, especially women training who are trying to lose body fat. Their minds are almost convinced that there's this idea that we need to not have any food before training to help us burn more body fat, or they feel guilty for eating before training because they think that, well, hold on, aren't I going to train to burn calories, not necessarily consuming calories to then burn them, if that makes sense. So they might think it's counterintuitive if they have a banana before training and then they're going to do a training session. Let's say they have a banana and some rice cakes and they're like, oh, but I've only burnt the same amount of calories that I would have eaten. It's like, that's not exactly how calories work. And we do definitely want to eat before our training sessions. It's actually more about shuffling your daily intake around so that you can take food from other meals or snacks or calories from other snacks and meals and actually put it right before your training. So it's not actually necessarily that, especially if you've got a fat loss goal, you don't necessarily need to eat more. It's probably that you're still eating in a calorie deficit across that 24 hours. You're still technically in, fat loss calorie ranges. But it's more that you need to move your calories and your specifically your carbohydrates to your pre-training snack or pre-training meal, and a little bit after your training as well, just to optimize things like, funnily enough, fat loss and performance. So let's talk about it. First up, I want to say there is no circumstance I would ever recommend to any client, no matter what phase they're going through, no matter what type of training they're undergoing, fasted high or moderate heart rate training sessions, completely fasted. There are some instances where we have seen endurance athletes, boxers, etc., runners that do fasted sessions to try and increase their ability to access fat stores as an energy source. But before you get too excited, this doesn't actually apply to those doing weights training. Our heart rate just isn't sustained high enough for long enough for that to occur. So they've actually studied this, and they know now that what's probably a better approach is a moderate to lower carbohydrate intake before training, so what they call training load for endurance athletes. But that won't apply to most people anyway who are listening to this podcast, because you're not doing endurance-based sports. Maybe you are, maybe you're doing a team sport or running, and maybe you're doing a marathon, in which case, yes, absolutely, called training low. And it's actually not that low, but just less carbs than, say, the higher dose would usually be recommended before some training sessions. So that would pretty much be the only circumstance I would recommend someone trying to inhibit, or at least reduce their carbohydrate intake on purpose prior to training. And it's not even that notable. You're still going to eat carbs. It's just that you're not going to eat as many as you might, do on, say, like an event day. So definitely only endurance athletes. But I work predominantly with everyday people who are going to the gym, doing weights training, going for walks. And that is the method we use for getting more definition and more muscle mass in things like your glutes, making sure you've got that hourglass body shape. So, having low to moderate carbohydrates prior really wouldn't apply to those people. What we do want is moderate to high carbs, depending on what your intake looks like. So if you are in a deficit, obviously it's going to be moderate because you're not going to have a lot of calories or carbs to work with. If you're in a surplus, it's going to be higher. Okay, so you're going to try and put as many carbs before your training as possible. There is a limit though, and I'll talk about that. So Second of all, sorry, I talked about don't train fasted. Do not do it. And there's a multitude of reasons as to why, but our body just doesn't actually function very well on next to no or no carbohydrates available, no glycogen, no available CHO, and low blood sugar. You would have tried at some point doing some sort of sport or activity, having not eaten or had low blood sugar, and you feel fucking awful for it. You feel like you're going to throw up. If you didn't know what that feeling was, then it is low blood sugar, or can be low sodium as well sometimes, one or the other. And so generally it's people going into fasted sessions, trying to push themselves really hard, and their body is just like not having a bar of it. A lot of that is to do with the fact it doesn't have carbohydrates. It doesn't have energy to access for what the preferred fuel source is for that heart rate training zone. So we're talking moderate to higher heart rates, which is literally most sports and activities other than things like walks and pool and playing pool and playing snooker or darts or something like that. So that's low heart rate work, okay? So we need energy from carbs to power our training. We know that, right? And when we have more energy from carbs, so if you think about it this way, if you have an energy source, let's say to put in your car, you have fuel to put in your car, it's going to go. Yeah, it's going to go somewhere. It's going to go further with 10 liters of fuel versus, I don't know how much fuel goes into a car. I know nothing about cars. Know a lot about humans, not a lot about cars. But let's say, you put a certain amount of liters in your car, it's going to go a certain distance, right? If you have no fuel in your car whatsoever, you've depleted your stores, let's say you're going for a fast, you say, Mariah, I'm going for a fasted session in the morning, and I don't want to eat, and I've eaten the night before. Yes, to a certain extent, we will have potentially, if you're not in a deep deficit, if you are in a deficit and you're dieting, potentially not, you might have burnt through it whilst you were sleeping. Because if you're in a deficit, you kind of want to burn through it because then that allows you to burn body fat. So when we burn past our carbs, we then burn body fat. So what our body accesses naturally in those low heart rate zones. So while we're sleeping, while we're standing, walking, that's where a lot of that fat burning can occur, right? The additional fat burning occurs in our sessions, yes, but not very efficiently without carbs. So when you're waking up in the morning and you don't have a lot of carbs or you have none and you're like, cool, I'm just going to, I had dinner last night, should be fine. Yes, to a certain extent, but when it's been a long time since we've consumed carbs and we've got them as glycogen stores, let's say there is some leftover glycogen stored in your muscle, right? It's where we store leftover carbs that we haven't used within the 48-hour window. Let's say we've stored some glycogen. Your body doesn't, our metabolic systems don't allow for us to access glycogen as easily as if we have some new and fresh carbs or CHO to work with to then spike our liver glucose and then blood glucose, right? So it's kind of like, imagine that when you eat carbs, or any form of carbohydrates, when you have an excess of carbohydrates, we have this storage system in our muscles, okay, for glycogen. So just imagine it like a fridge. You're literally putting the carbs you haven't eaten into the fridge, okay? It's just sitting there. It's not being stored as fat yet. It's just sitting there waiting to be used. It does weigh something. It uses water to carry it. So we talk about glycogen stores and water. Hope I haven't lost you just yet. So we've got these excess carbs that we haven't used as energy. What happens with those carbohydrates is that they kind of just sit there for a while, okay? When we want to re-access those carbohydrate stores, it is more efficient to access them with more carbs, when we consume more carbs. It sounds odd, but it's just this way of being able to spike our liver glucose and then blood glucose, and then we get the system rolling and we can access extra glycogen. So imagine those little doses of carbs before training, kind of like a lighter for a fire, right? So you're sparking that fire, right? If you don't spark that fire, unfortunately what happens is there's a bit of a disconnect there, and the carbs that we do have available, they can be accessed, but not as efficiently. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. So I'm using a lot of analogies here, but it's probably the easiest way to explain it to people. So carbs are really good for igniting our fire, whether the fire's been sitting in the fridge overnight and we need to spark it again, or let's say probably a better analogy is having a fire in the backyard and you've left it overnight, there's still some logs in there. That would be glycogen, right? It's just sitting there, we haven't used it. But to restart that fire, we need to add some leaves and we need to literally light it with a match or a lighter. Otherwise the fire's not going to start. So it's a pretty good analogy for even one of the sayings we hear in sports nutrition, which is fat burns in the flame of carbohydrates. So that's what leads me to my next point. that fire has some logs in it. And I've talked about this in podcasts previously about how logs are kind of like body fat, leaves are like carbs. So here we go. The analogies are getting better. I've gone from cars to fridges to fires. Yay. The fire is probably the better analogy of them. So we have these logs of body fat, right? We can't just go into a workout and expect the logs to just light on fire, just miraculously start burning. Body fat, if it were that easily accessible as an energy source, we wouldn't get hungry for carbs. We wouldn't get hungry for protein or need it. We would just eat our own body fat and be done with it. But obviously that doesn't happen. We've all got extra body fat stores, and for some reason they're stubborn as hell. And so this is the secret, right? Is if you have carbs before training, it allows us to access more lipids, so fat stores, in a human biochemical process called the Krebs cycle, okay? Or the citric acid cycle. There's plenty of names for it. It's very complex. If you want to Google the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, have a look at that for a doozy. Some people have to memorize that. I memorized some of it as a sports nutritionist, as an openly accredited sports nutritionist, openly practicing as well. But yeah, it's an interesting time. It's a biochemical mess. So that's the Krebs cycle. It's complex as fuck. Anyway, the Krebs cycle is basically what happens when we consume carbohydrates prior to moderate to high heart rate training, a certain amount. It is a range. And then it's allowing us to have enough energy in those moderate to high heart rate zones to then pick up fat stores in that cycle, in that process, which allows us to burn both carbs and fats together. Okay, that's pretty cool. Now, of course, we can burn fats on their own, but here's the thing. In low heart rate zones, that's where we predominantly burn fat only and no carbs. So we access fats and hardly any carbohydrates. But that only really happens with walking. And obviously we don't want to just walk everywhere and burn fat, because then we end up with no muscle if we're not doing weights training. So we end up with a flat pancake bum, right? So we want the weights training, we want to keep that. We want to add walks in too, because that allows us to burn a little bit more energy. And in those low heart rate zones, we don't need carbs for those walks. I'll talk about that later in the podcast. But prior to your training session, you must eat some form of carbs. Carbs are the priority. More than fats, more than protein. In fact, I would even be as bold to say is to try and remove as much of the protein and fats as possible prior to your training, as in the close window, so that kind of half an hour to 1 hour prior to training. I have a really strange thing that happens to me when I'm training. I get quite hungry mid-training, and so sometimes I actually find I do need to consume protein prior to my training alongside carbs, and that's just me individually. I tend to burn through things really quickly. You can team carbs up with a little bit of fats to try and have them be absorbed a little slower, but however, you need to keep in mind that when you do have protein, fats or fiber, or all three of them in larger amounts prior to training, close to training, you can cause some digestive upset. So this is why you don't want to have, no one wants to eat a big steak and then go for a big training session, because, that in itself makes you feel sick just thinking about it. So generally the rule of thumb is like try and keep I just keep it around these ratios and ranges, but 3 to 5 grams at the most of fiber. I'd even be as bold to say 3 grams of fiber. Fiber is that brushy stuff that's in fruits and vegetables, okay, and grains. So 3 to 5 grams, I'd say 3 at the most of fiber. 3 to 5 grams of fats, you can probably keep it to around 3, and protein, same thing, 3 to 5 grams at the most. So, and this can help to actually stop your tummy from being upset. So every time you say to me, look, I think I feel like I can't eat prior to training because it makes my tummy upset, have a look at one of those factors. Are you eating too much of one of those things, fiber, fats, protein, or a combination of all three? This could be what's working against you with regards to digestive upset, GI upset. So anyway, that would be my recommendations. And I'll talk about the ranges as well, so in a moment. But in addition to what I was talking about, being able to use carbs prior to training those moderate to high heart rate zones, it allows us to lift heavier, run faster, push harder, jump higher, and perform more efficiently, which, believe it or not, sees us using more energy than we would during a fasted session. So it seems strange, and again, it's the concept is counterintuitive. You're telling me to eat food to burn more energy. Eat energy to burn more energy. Yes, correct. So again, I'll use the car analogy because this works really well, or even the fire, right? We can't, and the crazy thing about fire is it's heat, it's energy burnt. Same with a car. When a car is driving it, there's heat, there's energy burnt. So it's all the same shit, just different in a sense of humans are very different to cars. I will admit that. But you can't expect a fire to burn bigger and brighter if you're not feeding it fuel. Yeah. So the more we put on there, the more it's going to burn, the more energy it's going to let off. Yeah. Now, there is obviously a limit to this. We're not talking about having your entire day, oh, I'll just eat an unlimited amount of carbohydrates and I'll burn tons of energy. And, there is a ceiling, obviously. So, but that's the whole reason why athletes use carbs. They're no different, and the benefits are no different for general population, is that, having carbs prior to training gives an athlete energy. You see them drinking Gatorade, having those glucogels, it gives them energy. It gives us energy as well to put more into our workouts. So you would find, and there's a lot of studies to show this as well, with a specific amount of calories burnt on average. But like if you went and did a leg session, and you didn't hit any PBs and you were fasted and you're like, man, I didn't hit any PBs. I even went backwards in some lifts. And then you went back and you did that same session with even 30 grams of carbohydrates prior to your training session, 40 grams, 60 grams if you really get excited. You'd be surprised. Not only would you be hitting PBs or doing better in that session, but if you were to record your calories burnt in the session fasted versus the session that is fed, what we call fed with carbohydrates, you would burn more energy in the fed session. So it's a no-brainer. I would want to, if I was given that tool to say, do you know what, you can eat the same amount of calories across the entire day, you can still be in a calorie deficit, eat the meals you're currently eating on your meal plan or in your calorie deficit, but let's move some carbs closer to your training and prior to your training, and we can outsmart this and burn more calories just by doing that. Wouldn't you say yes to that? Wouldn't you go, shit, I'm probably not going to do a fasted session in the morning anymore because I'm actually not burning more energy in these sessions fasted? Not that I think I am. I don't personally, but if you think that, if you go, okay, well, I'm going to burn more body fat if I'm fasted. What if I told you you're actually going to burn more energy overall for the day if you're fed, right? And what we want to make sure is that you are burning more energy overall for the day. There's no sort of specific way that we can burn more body fat in a fasted sense. There's been plenty of studies into it and nada, we found nothing. It's the actual average calories across the whole day. So if we shuffle those around and have carbs prior to training, we're actually training smarter to be able to train harder, but it doesn't feel like it's harder. Pretty cool. So it's not only beneficial for performance, but also for fat loss. Okay, so we're not just talking about athletes and people who are in the Olympics and everything like that, and Olympic teams. We're talking about everyday people as well. This applies to your neighbor, you, a postpartum mum. There is no exception to the rule. Okay, so here's the fine print. 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates. If you don't know what this is, look on the back of packets or even look it up in MyFitnessPal, which will show you the grams of carbs included in that food item. So it doesn't have to, I'm not saying it weighs 30 to 60 grams, don't get confused. In a food item, there is a certain amount of grams of carbs. There will also be water, there will also be potentially fats and protein as well, and fiber. So it's made up of a few things, but there will be a certain amount of carbs in carb-dense foods that you can track, right? So 30 to 60 grams of carbs on the lower end. So we're talking that's the range on the lower end. Sometimes it's 30 to 40 grams, the recommendations. It can differ, but at a minimum 30 grams, 30 minutes to 1 hour before training. So that's probably if you're in like a moderate deficit, if you're dieting at the moment, 30 to 60 grams or 30 to 40 grams. If you're thinking 60 is quite a lot of my total intake, because obviously it will differ from person to person. And the actual recommendations are based on body weight. Okay, so these are just ranges which help you out a little bit, as opposed to having to calculate your body weight in grams. But generally 60 to 90 grams of carbs for the first 90 minutes. So 60 to 90 grams of carbs for the first 90 minutes of exercise. Okay, for most moderate to higher heart rate training. And then an additional 60 to 90 grams of carbs each following hour, but typically 60 grams, because obviously you think about it, 60 to 90 for the first 90 minutes and then around 60 for each hour past that point, yeah? And it's a lot more feasible to get that 60 grams in as opposed to the 90, because once we start getting up to 90 grams, it's quite difficult to eat that, swallow it, drink it, have that all whirling around in your tummy and then go back to your session. So we see that 60 grams tends to be a bit more feasible for an athlete or a general population human being. Or again, as I said, there's a variance of this of 40 to 60 grams of carbs per hour for runners in training of low to moderate dose carbs. So basically not, as I said before, not training high. This is a lot of what we see with like training for marathons, etc. And then on the actual day, they'll dose a higher carbohydrate dosage than that. And you might even see them going slightly lower than that as well. So again, doesn't really apply to Gen Pop, and I say Gen Pop as in like everyday people, unless you are training for a marathon or a triathlon. Or we can go as low as 20 grams for those in a deep deficit. So I've had people on, 100 grams of carbs, 90 grams of carbs in depletion. And obviously if you think about that, like that's not a lot of carbs. So, however, I would still recommend around a third of their carbs prior to training, so 30 grams, because that will make a massive difference in their performance and obviously in burning energy and fat burning as well. So at 2 to 4 hours prior, you should have a meal constituting a higher amount of carbs if feasible, anywhere from 60 to 120 grams of carbohydrates, although the absorption rate per minute for CHO seems to be limited to an upper limit of 120 to 140 gram dose. So basically we see that there is a slow rate of absorption for carbohydrates, or at least there is a gradual or like a limit where they can be absorbed, and we see that ceiling is around 120 to 140 grams typically. So obviously if you're having 140, 150 grams of carbs in your lunch, just be mindful that you may not actually absorb all of those to be able to then have that readily available as glycogen. If exercise exceeds 90 minutes, the 90-minute time frame, so I talked about 90 minutes and then dosing every 60 after that, glycogen stores are typically depleted and therefore you may need to refuel. So that's why we use that 90-minute window. Each dose or redose of carbs triggers liver glucose, then blood glucose to rise, facilitating an insulin response to then power up the energy use of CHO and lipids through the Krebs cycle, as I mentioned previously. The Krebs or citric acid cycle is utilized in moderate to higher heart rate zone training. So this is again reiterating the reason why we want to eat carbs. So anything upwards of 120 BPMs heart rate, or basically your typical walking heart rate. This would apply for literally almost any sport exceeding a duration of 20 minutes and beyond. So we're talking weights training, running, martial arts, team sports, gymnastics, dancing, etc. It does not apply, as I said, to lower heart rate activities such as walking, darts, or snooker. So these are, interestingly enough, activities you can perform fasted, as I said, or even on a lower dose, or even pay no consideration to carb timing at all. I would even argue to try to keep your walks post-training or away from your training in a window of your day where your carb stores are low, right? So it's like, why do I need to put my walk after carbs? I don't. Shuffle your daily carbs around to suit your training needs. So this is something I talk about basically in that we don't, as I said prior, we don't need to necessarily, and if you've got the room to work with and you're in a surplus, or you're an athlete who doesn't know what you're consuming and maybe you need more carbs. Let's say you're in a deficit, and I'll use this as an example because it's probably the best one. If you're in a deficit, you're trying to lose body fat and you're like, yeah, Mariah, that's all good and well, but I don't have any carbs to work with. I've already done my meal plan for the day and I've got nothing to work with. What do I do here, right? Do I just need to eat more carbs? No. You can actually remove one of your snacks, remove some rice from your lunch. You shouldn't be eating rice if you're dieting, but you can remove some potato from your dinner, whatever it looks like. Shuffle your day around a little bit, still hitting your fiber target, but then taking some carbs from another meal or changing the meal entirely. So your carbs then go into your pre-training. Okay, and as I said, that half an hour to an hour prior to your training is where that dosage of anywhere from as low as 30 grams of carbs for those really deeply dieting, or 60 to 90 grams of carbs, 60 being the moderate amount, and then 90 for those who have got a larger amount of carbs on their plate, and we can even go up to 120 for those who have got really high amount of carbohydrates available to use, say, in a surplus. So we shuffle our carbs around, we move them to be mostly surrounding our training, so before our training, okay? And also the 2 to 4 hours, I'll get there. So 1 hour prior to training, yes, that's one dose, that really quick one. And then 2 to 4 hours prior to training, we want that other dose, so that big dose. So basically, it would look like having lunch with anywhere from, again, those who are in a calorie deficit, 30, 40 grams of carbs, up to 120 grams of carbs. I probably wouldn't recommend much more than that. And then a couple of hours later, you might then go, cool, it's an hour to half an hour before my training session, I'm gonna have my pre-workout snack, you know, or it could look like pre-workout snack in the morning when you're fasted, you're like, oh God, I don't feel like eating much. I'll talk about that in a second. You could have that. Then you could have, now obviously this is hard because you can't eat another meal 2 to 4 hours prior to that, right? But we would hope that we have a little bit of glycogen left over from the previous evening's dinner. And typically if you train at the same time every single day, which I would recommend doing, you'll actually find that that natural 24-hour cycle will just start again. So you'll end up basically little carbs in the morning before your session, early in the morning, you have your session, you have your carbs and protein and fats after, like your breakfast, you might have morning tea, lunch, snack, whatever, dinner. You're not using those carbs very much for the remainder of the day, so they kind of stack in as your glycogen. Even if you're in a deficit, you might have a bit of glycogen. And then obviously as the evening goes on, then you have your dinner, and then hopefully we can hold some glycogen to then be used in that morning session. Hopefully we don't burn through it whilst we're sleeping. So this is why morning sessions can sometimes be a bit harder for those who are in a deficit. And I would sometimes recommend maybe doing afternoon sessions or evening sessions for people who are in a deficit, who are finding morning sessions are struggling a little bit, because then you've got the whole day's worth of carbs and glycogen to work with. And as I said, I want you to consume the largest chunk of your carbs before and after your training. So before, obviously we have that nice bolus, and then after, it's less important to have a larger amount post-training for sure. Like obviously we want to try and prioritize energy for the session, but post-training we do need some carbs for recovery. So it can be between 20 to 40 grams, 60 grams if you really have a lot of carbs to work with. It doesn't have to be a lot, it just needs to be enough to then facilitate getting those glycogen stores back, to then obviously allow for a repeat session the following day, whatever that might look like. And we do find typically that some carbs post-session is better than none, paired with protein, of course. Around 1 to 3 hours post-session is perfectly fine. So it could look like a meal, a nice balanced meal. So as I mentioned, keep your fiber, protein and fats on the lower end, less than 3 to 5 grams. I just like to stick with the rule of thumb of around 3 for each to avoid digestive upset. It can be hard to do that. And I would say probably the least invasive of those 3 would be potentially protein, because fats can just cause that indigestion, and the same with fiber as well. If you ever noticed you've had like serious indigestion after a meal and then training, that is why. So some examples of snacks lower in fiber and higher in carbohydrates, and you're not limited, like you can obviously have as much of these or as little of these as you like to try and meet these requirements if you're tracking your macros. Otherwise, your coach should be able to do your pre-training snack for you if not. Rice cakes, rice crackers, yep, a lot of rice-based products there. Rice cereal, I don't know whether you guys have ever tried the rice cereal stuff. It's interesting tasting. Tastes like sand to me, I hate it. I'd rather just eat rice crackers. Cereal in general, like Milo cereal, lots of different types of cereal, they get the massive tick of approval from sports nutritionists. Your favorite flavor of cereal. Honey, yes, so honey is nice and low in fiber. You can put honey on rice cakes if you want extra carbs. Juice, so fruit juice. Be careful of this one though, too much liquid. You can find that unfortunately that you will get indigestion or stitches. So just keep an eye on that and make sure it's maybe an hour away from training or 45 minutes, just so that you don't get that sloshy feeling in your stomach. Carb powder, which you can add to your intra-workout or preferentially half an hour prior, because we do see a better benefit for training being that timing rather than intra-workout carbs. Intra-workout carbs have some evidence to support an increase in performance, and obviously then redosing every 60 minutes after that 90-minute mark. But we do find that half hour to 1 hour prior to training is the magic window. Or fruit like banana, although as I said, it will come with fiber, so you've got to be cautious of that. But I find that I tend to go okay with banana prior to training, and it just depends on each person. You can train your GI tract to be more tolerant to slightly more fiber, protein, etc. fats. So it's interesting, but I wouldn't go and eat a very fatty meal, or a lot of people will go and do a big training session after they've kind of binged, and I wouldn't recommend doing that because it will make you feel very sick. Be sure to consume your carbs with water. As I said, water is the #1 sports performance aid that exists, so it's actually more important than carbohydrates. So if you're finding your sessions are quite flat, it's predominantly going to be your hydration status, your lack of water prior to and during training, even your hydration status from the day, and then your carbohydrates will be the second factor. The third factor is definitely things like something basic like adding salt to the pre-workout meal to increase your hydration and electrolytes for your exercise bout. So sodium chloride, being the I suppose sodium as well particularly, is used predominantly in this process of using carbohydrates as an energy source, as well as potassium. Obviously the other electrolytes are used as well, but we see that, you know, these are really important for this process. So I just like to see clients having salt somewhere in their day. You don't have to necessarily have it with your pre-workout meal, but if you have thought, shit, I haven't had any salt today because I've made all my meals from scratch and I haven't added salt to my lunch or dinner or anything, you can definitely add salt to your pre-workout snack. So anyway, that is about it. I'm not going to harp on too much about hydration because that would be another podcast, but certainly amongst this, not just don't train fasted, but don't train dehydrated either. Always train hydrated, at least a liter of water prior to training, not obviously sculling it because then again you might get a stitch, a liter during training at a minimum, and then obviously afterwards as well. So you want to have a lot of, it's not just your carbohydrates, sorry I'm sticking to my couch, it's not just your carbohydrates that you want to have in, during and after your training, but you also want to have a lot of your hydration surrounding that workout as well. And you'll actually find you'll have a much better time of your workouts. You won't feel so weak, dizzy, sick in the tummy, because sometimes, as I said, that low carbs, low blood sugar will do that. And trust me when I say it will make your life so much better just for making this very small adjustment to your diet. So for those who are training fasted in the morning, you don't have to go crazy with it. As I said, you can kind of stick to that lower end of the recommended carbohydrate dosage. Start with that. Even eat it on the way to the gym. Give yourself plenty of time to digest it. Even if it's like a handful of lollies, something like that, just really simple. And then obviously then you can have that digested by the time that you have got to your session. And you will find that your morning sessions will go from being, average, mediocre to being incredible. Anyway, that is it from me. Tried to keep this podcast a little bit shorter. I don't even know how long I've been talking for. Sometimes I ramble, go around in circles and then come back to a topic and I'm thinking to myself, my listeners must just really enjoy how erratic I can be. I did write a lot down. So, and a lot of this is from my sports nutrition studies, but also, in general, like we don't have these numbers. I did have them in my head already, but we just like to, I guess, like go back over them again and make sure that they're right. So it was nice to go back over them and see that yes, what I'd thought of was already what I wanted to talk about. Anyway, that is it from me. Looking forward to doing another podcast for you soon. Thanks a lot. Bye.